Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Strategy Guide to Enable and Promote the Use of Fixed Route Transit by People with Disabilities webinar. My name is Derek, and I'll be your operator for today. At this time, all participants are on a listen-only mode. We shall facilitate a question-and-answer session at the end of the conference. If you require operator assistance, please press *0, and an operator will be happy to assist you. At this time, I would like to turn the conference over to Ms. Lori Glickman. You may proceed.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone, and on behalf of the National Transit Institute, I thank you for participating in the TCRP 163 Strategy Guide to Enable and Promote the Use of Fixed Route Transit by People with Disabilities webinar. The National Transit Institute develops, promotes, and delivers training and education programs for the public transit industry in the United States. We are pleased to have 4 presenters today. They are Russell Thatcher, President, Thatcher Consulting, LLC, Elizabeth Buffy Ellis, Senior Transportation Planner, KFH Group, Marilyn Golden, Senior Policy Analyst, Disability Rights, Education and Defense Fund, and David Shaw, Senior Associate, Transportation Group, The Collaborative, Inc. The webinar format will consist of the four speakers presenting their material, followed by a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. You can participate in the discussion at the end by hitting *1 on the phone, and the operator will let you speak your question to everyone at the designated time, or you can always use the chat pod in the bottom left of the screen. If you've not already printed out a copy of the presentation that was emailed to you, you can click on the handout document in the upper left corner of your screen where it says Files. You can also email Barbara Van Dyke at cvandyke@nti.rutgers.edu, and she will be glad to assist you. I will now turn the presentation over to Russell.
Great. Thank you, Lori, and welcome to everyone who's joining us today. My name again is Russell Thatcher, and I was the principal investigator for the research, and I'm going to be joined in the presentation by the other 3 principal authors of the report. And what we'd like to discuss today is TCRP Report 163, which focused on enabling and promoting use of fixed route service by people with disabilities. It was a report that was published by TRB in 2013, but based on the number of attendees we have today, it still looks like there's a lot of interest and relevance of this topic. Before we get into the content and findings of the research, I wanted to just talk a little bit about the purpose of the report. And the impetus for the report was a significant growth in ADA paratransit ridership from 1999 through 2012. The chart on this page shows estimated ridership that went from 68.6 million trips in 1999 to about 106.2 million paratransit trips in 2012, or a 55% increase. That significant increase raised a lot of concern about the sustainability of ADA paratransit service. And back in 2009, 2010, there was a lot of focus on what was called managing paratransit demand, quote unquote, with cuts in service areas, raising fares, and other ways to try and manage the growth of ADA paratransit service. This project and this report takes a slightly different approach. Rather than focusing on limiting mobility, it really focuses on trying to maximize travel opportunities and promote the use of fixed route as well as paratransit service, which obviously is also in keeping with the main goals of the ADA to promote independence and integration. And I want to just acknowledge before we get started that this foresight on changing the focus to promoting fixed route use was one that was developed by the American Public Transit Association, or APTA, their ADA subcommittee, and they submitted the research statement for this project. One of the first things that we did for this research was just try and document the current use of transit services by people with disabilities. We wanted to know before we got started on the project whether the growth in paratransit ridership was due to a disproportionate use of paratransit by people with disabilities, or whether it was just an increase in travel brought about by the improvements made by the ADA overall and greater travel by people with disabilities. And the results of this first effort, first task, were pretty interesting. To develop the information, we analyzed ridership at 7 different systems across the country, and these were systems from large cities such as Chicago down to smaller areas such as Ann Arbor or Grand River, Ohio, and different parts of the country as well. And we looked at fixed route ridership by people with disabilities as well as paratransit ridership for a 3-year period at these 7 systems. And what we found was that fixed route ridership by people with disabilities was about 5.9 times higher than ADA paratransit ridership. The bar chart on this page shows that in 2010, for example, for the 7 selected systems, their total fixed route ridership was about 39.4 million trips, and their paratransit ridership was about 6.7 million trips. Looking at their trends in ridership, fixed route growth in ridership ranged from 1% to 26% and averaged about 10.4% per year. And on paratransit, we saw one system that actually had a decrease in ridership, down 9.7%, up to a maximum growth at one of the systems of 12.4%. So on average, paratransit increased 2.4%. So in addition to being many times larger, fixed route ridership was also growing faster at these 7 systems during this 3-year period. And the other thing that we found in analyzing the ridership was that the share of fixed route ridership by people with disabilities increased at these 7 systems. So in 2009, it made up about 4.7% of their fixed route ridership, and by the end of 2011, it was about 5.4%. And I would note that when we documented fixed route ridership at these systems, we were looking at their trips made by people who paid the reduced fare who had a disability. So in many ways that might undercount the total ridership by people with disabilities if people use the service at full fare. The next thing that we wanted to do in the study before trying to develop strategies for promoting fixed route use was to get a better sense of the factors that affected both fixed route and paratransit service by people with disabilities. And that part of the research was conducted by Marilyn Golden and Dretta. So I'll let Marilyn present that.
Thank you, Russell. Starting with slide 5 as it's showing on your screen, I'll be reporting on a web-based survey of people with disabilities that was open for 24 days in April and May of 2012. We knew there was considerable interest in these subjects, and still we were bowled over by the enthusiastic response from my community, from the disability community. In the kickoff, we sent a lot of lists and individuals the survey link, and when I learned that 2 hours later we had received over 70 completed survey responses, I knew he had tapped into something big. As you can see, we ended up with almost 2,000 responses in just a little more than 3 weeks. Interestingly, over a third of respondents were using both the fixed route and ADA paratransit systems, as you can see on the left half of this slide. More than a quarter used fixed route only, totaling a solid majority of all respondents using the fixed route service, at least partly. Just under a quarter used ADA paratransit only, and under a fifth did not use transit at all. On the right-hand side, you can see that when asked if you'd like to use the fixed route service more, a whopping 53% said yes. A fifth said no, and the rest were not sure. On slide 6, The study found that people with disabilities are using both fixed route and ADA paratransit, and that ridership is increasing on both modes. Clearly, public transit is playing a major role in providing independence and mobility. Moving to the next slide, we have a very informative chart that I hope isn't too hard to read, but good that you have copies accessible if you need them. The survey asked, how important is each of a list of factors for people in deciding whether to use the fixed route transit service, keeping in mind that people aren't only deliberating between fixed route and, in some cases, if eligible, ADA paratransit, but also other options, including riding with family and friends, going as a pedestrian, taking another service such as a taxi, or even simply not going, which is something we don't like to see. The list of factors including everything from issues that may dissuade any rider, such as the hours the fixed route service runs, where it goes, what it costs. Also factors such as getting to and from stops and stations, including their distance, the complexity of transfers, problems accommodating mobility aids, problems with stop announcements, problems with other passengers' attitudes or negative past experiences with using the fixed route service, and even to be sure we didn't make assumptions. Does a basic lack of knowledge of the fixed route service dissuade any would-be riders? So to briefly interpret this, the colored areas on the chart, the most people in the top, roughly in the top left in dark blue, from a high of 48%, rank barriers in the pedestrian environment getting to and from stops and stations as the most important factor in deciding whether to use the fixed route service. That is good news because there's something that can be done about it. And it was a strong reminder of the importance of providing access to the public rights-of-way, streets and sidewalks making up the pedestrian environment. Other high-ranking factors including distances to stops, fixed-route headways, multiple transfers, and hours of operation. I think I just need to go back just for a moment, just to give you a general sense of this. The factors that got highest rankings of not being important, bottom right in light blue, included the lack of accommodation and mobility aids, suggesting that the transit industry has moved forward in that area. The lack of knowledge of how to use fixed route, similarly was not ranked as a high factor, and the cost of fixed route travel appeared to be of lesser importance to these respondents. And then back to sort of the numbers. This slide is a summary slide explaining that the top factors rated very important by the most respondents included barriers, as I said before, barriers in the pedestrian environment, 48%, and I won't give all the numbers, but it's sort of gradually going down the scale of what was the most important. The next most was distance to and from the stops, fixed route headways, multiple transfers, hours of operation, lack of information about barriers in the environment out there, and concerns for personal safety ranked highly by 35% of respondents, so more than a third. Moving on, the other factors related less highly, but important to some respondents, were accommodation of people's mobility devices at 26%, and moving down the scale, driver attitude and driver assistance were important to about, again, a quarter of the people, lack of stop announcements, poor fixed route service quality, attitudes of other passengers, negative past experiences using the fixed route service. The cost of the fixed route service was important to 17% of respondents. So not a huge factor, but definitely a factor for some people. And people not being sure how to use the fixed route service was also ranked by about 17%. Now I want to turn things back over to Russell.
Great, thanks, Marilyn. And using that input that we got from people with disabilities, we tried to identify some strategies that could assist in affecting those concerns and those barriers. We did this in a couple of ways. We did it first through an extensive literature search, and then we sent out a survey to all 674 transit agencies that provided both fixed route and paratransit services, ADA paratransit, back in 2012. We received 163 responses from transit agencies and a lot of good ideas on what they were doing to promote and enable the use of their fixed route services. And we put these together into the overall strategy that's presented in the report. The strategy has two important first steps that we feel should be taken by any transit agency, and then 5 possible strategies that can be considered depending upon local issues and needs and what would be appropriate. And what we'd like to do for the rest of the presentation is just go through those first 2 important steps and then each of the possible strategies that you could consider. The first step that we feel is important for all transit agencies who want to promote greater use of fixed route has 2 components. And the first would be to start off by developing a baseline and getting a good understanding of what the current use of transit services are by riders with disabilities in your area. And that would be something similar to what we did, looking at both your fixed route and your paratransit ridership. What are the trends? And then also reaching out to riders to see what are the important factors for them in using fixed route versus paratransit service. And I will mention that in the report there is a copy of the survey that Marilyn used to reach out to consumers across the country, and you could customize that and use that for your area. The second would be to establish a system-wide accessibility policy that talks about what all departments and divisions need to do to promote fixed route use. And too often we found that responsibility for managing paratransit demand and shifting trips from paratransit to fixed route rested in the paratransit department, where we felt that it would be more appropriate that that be a primary concern of the fixed route operating division. It would be important to include specific responsibilities in that policy to set goals based on the baseline information you develop about current use of fixed route service, and then measure people's effectiveness and their job performance on whether or not those goals are being met. So for example, if you found that people with disabilities made up 5% of the fixed route riders, when you set your baseline, you might want to set that at 5.5%, 6%, and on an annual basis measure how well your fixed route department is doing in achieving those goals. The second very important step that we feel all transit agencies ought to do is somewhat obvious, but certainly if you're encouraging people to use the fixed route service more, you need to make sure that it's accessible and it's actually usable by people with disabilities. And this would mean making sure that stops are being announced, making sure that route identification announcements are being made, and making sure that employee training is effective, and that people with disabilities, when they use the service, are treated in a courteous way, and that your operators know how to operate all of the accessibility equipment. An important part of making sure that your fixed route services are accessible and usable is an effective monitoring system. And the guide talks about doing monitoring more than just with your road supervisors who might be known to the drivers, but perhaps introducing a secret rider program to evaluate whether or not stop announcements are being made, securement systems being done correctly, people are being treated courteously, etc. Another important part of making sure that the fixed route is accessible and usable is to make sure that vehicles are designed to be as accessible and usable as possible. And this means not only meeting the regulatory minimum requirements for design, but going beyond that as well. And we found in the survey of transit agencies a number of things that had been done beyond the regulatory requirements in vehicle design. The picture on the left shows a reach-through barrier behind the securement area that allows drivers, and this was from Golden Empire Transit in the San Francisco Bay Area, to more easily reach the securement systems and secure riders who are using mobility aids. The picture on the right shows a tether strap, or what used to be called a Stokes strap, that can help secure a wide variety of different mobility aids. And other things not pictured here that we found. Corpus Christi, Texas is beginning to design its fixed route buses to have 3 securement locations rather than 2, as they see increased ridership by people who use mobility devices. So just, again, doing whatever you can to make sure that people with disabilities are able to use the service and that the service is accessible as possible. In addition to these 2 first steps, then there are a number of different strategies that you could consider. The first strategy that addressed one of the top concerns was making sure that bus stops are reachable and accessible. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Buffy Ellis, who did this part of the research.
Okay, thanks, Russ. As he mentioned, this is the first strategy in the report. And why is this first? Well, basically for the reasons that Marilyn talked about in the survey, is that survey found that barriers in the pedestrian environment that affect access to and from the stops and stations were rated as the most important when people with disabilities were considering whether or not to use fixed route. And we know that a lot of agencies are making improvements to the actual bus stops, but the need for accessibility extends beyond the stop, and more agencies are beginning to take that broader look. So some of the common problems I've listed here on this slide, I'll just mention a few. There may be accessibility from just one direction at the nearest intersection, so there's a curb cut on one side but not on the other. There may be no ADA compliant landing pad. Sidewalks may not connect with a bus stop. And then speaking about sidewalks, actually the condition of the sidewalks and the landing pads where they exist may be in poor condition. It may be broken, uneven pavement, etc. So to be fully usable for people with disabilities, those sidewalks need to be in a state of good repair. So the key action that a transit agency can undertake to approach stop improvements is to develop a comprehensive bus stop inventory and assessment. This really is the foundation for moving forward. A comprehensive inventory provides data that can be used for a bunch of different reasons, including providing information for individual trip planning for a rider, for conditional ADA paratransit eligibility determination, for travel training, service planning, facility needs assessment, and so forth. And the actual improvement of the accessibility of stops and the infrastructure, it's a process. It involves, different actions and often different agencies, particularly if the transit agency is separate from the jurisdiction, if it's an authority or a district. In those cases, successfully doing the improvements typically requires that the entities coordinate together. So the stop inventory itself looks at conditions at each bus stop and the immediate pedestrian environment. The data that should be collected for each stop includes location data, including the longitude and latitude coordinates, the nearest intersection, heading direction of the bus when stopped at that particular stop, the position relative to the intersection, near side, far side, mid-block. Are there passenger amenities? What about the accessibility features? The actual boarding and alighting area, is there a sidewalk, curb ramps, any obstructions? And then, of course, safety is just very important. How close is the stop to the nearest intersection? Is there a marked crosswalk? Is there a pedestrian crossing signal? I note that some of these features are subject to the federal AGDAG requirements, such as sidewalk width and running slope, so these things need to be measured specifically. This slide shows what you should not do. On the left is there's no landing pad, and on the right is a very unsafe pedestrian crossing at a mid-block stop.
So once you have that database of stops, the next step is analyzing what's needed to make the improvements. And there's not enough funding, of course, to do everything, so it's good to categorize the improvements as short-term, medium-term, and longer-term. For example, short-term improvements could be done relatively quickly and with little cost. And shown in this slide on the left there, if you just trim those shrubs, it makes the sidewalk accessible, particularly for someone using a wheelchair. So this next slide actually are a couple of before and after photos. On the left, you can see there's no sidewalk or landing pad. The bench is way too close to the street. The improvements on the right side show a new pad and a sidewalk with a curb ramp that goes to the Mark Street crossing. The bottom two photos on the left, there's no landing pad, the sidewalk doesn't connect to the stop. And then on the right, the improvements involve moving the stop to more level ground, installing a compliant ADA landing pad, and then connecting the sidewalk with the landing pad. So one of the interesting parts of the study was that we did case studies at several transit agencies that actually had gone through this whole process and made improvements to their stops and the pedestrian infrastructure. And really the most interesting was TriMet in Portland. And what the agency there did was make stop and infrastructure improvements along a high ridership corridor. They did this in partnership with the Oregon DOT, spent more than $500,000 upgrading 17 bus stops along that corridor. They repaired and constructed incomplete and damaged sidewalks. They added 10 bus shelters and pads at the stops. And you can see the photo on the left shows that big drainage ditch. There's really no sidewalk. And then on the right, you can see major improvements. And then what was particularly interesting about this case study is they actually looked at what happened after the improvements were in place. And what they found is that the lift deployments for the fixed route service at those 17 stops nearly doubled just in the first year after the improvements. And then the lift deployments continued to increase, more than doubling over a 3-year period. And then really even more interesting, they looked at ADA paratransit ridership in a quarter-mile radius of those improved stops. And what that data showed is that the ridership by conditional ADA riders actually decreased by 12% the year before compared to 2 years after the improvements. However, the data for fully eligible riders really showed no change. And so it's of course improvements for the conditional riders that are most beneficial because they are the riders that are able to use fixed route in some cases. So our parting advice for this strategy is really this: don't let the scale of what you have to do to make those improvements keep you from getting started. You make the stop and infrastructure improvements as plans and funding allowed. Prioritize those improvements and then work towards greater accessibility over time. So the next strategy, David is going to talk about that.
Okay, thank you, Buffy. Let me talk about 2 more strategies for promoting fixed route for use by persons with disability. First, I'm going to talk about marketing and public information, which is targeted to specific rider groups. And the ones that we are going to talk about are first-time riders, or those who only are using it basically Monday to Friday as commuters. And someone revealed this to me a long time ago, which really was very thought-provoking, is that for people who might be going to paratransit, or people who are baby boomers or seniors who are still mobile, may have never been using fixed route previously in their life, or very rarely. So it's important to get them into habit as one option, not to have them using fixed route exclusively, but get them in the habit and make them more comfortable and encourage the use. The second group of people that you want to target information to about the benefits of fixed route are persons with disability, and you want to promote the accessible features of your fixed route system. You want to talk about in the buses that you have ramps and lifts so that you don't have to climb stairs, and if you happen to have rail systems, that you have elevators and ramps, the presence of announcements so that they don't feel like they're going to miss their stop, having good signage, and also when it comes to providing information beforehand that you've got a good website where they could look everything up that they think they need to know ahead of time. You should also be working with agencies, both public and private, that have senior citizens and persons with disabilities as their clients. Agencies such as councils on aging, senior centers, senior housing areas, both public and private, as well as disability groups. And what we found, and what many transit agencies found, is that you'll find this type of marketing as you put it together and as you promote the availability and the accessibility of fixed route, accessible fixed route, also helps with the larger potential general public rider population. And again, when you have the information, you should have a good website as well as printed material, because nowadays a lot of people are going to, first thing they do when they want to find out about something is go look for you on your website. Let me talk a little bit about travel training, something which I'm sure many of you are aware of and have perhaps implemented to some degree at your transit agency. And travel training, can be, they're basically two basic sort of categories. There's either group training or sort of general orientation, where you tell people about your service. You may take a group of them on a trip. You show them all the different features, and that you, hopefully this is an introduction to them and let them explore further on their own. And then there is also one-on-one travel training, where you are one trainer is working very specifically with one individual, maybe an individual and their companion, to help them understand the system, and in particular to let them understand and teach them how to get from a particular destination, usually home, to another destination and back. And this is very important. And one way you can really integrate travel training into your whole system, especially with persons with disability, is to automatically have that as part of your overall ADA paratransit eligibility for riders who are determined either not eligible or conditional. Just want to mention, the TCRP report that we created has a much more extensive discussion about travel training and some of the places that we gathered information from. Let me talk about a couple of them that are mentioned on this slide 18. First, Intercity Transit, which is in Olympia, Washington. They estimated that in a year that they moved 17,000 trips from paratransit over to fixed route. And with a net cost, meaning the cost of the paratransit minus the fare on fixed route, that they estimated that they saved well over $668,000 in that year. The training costs, meanwhile, were only about $83,000 for that year. So they saved well over $500,000 a year from this travel training program. Another case study, a much larger system, Washington Metro, WMATA in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. The year that we were looking at, they had trained 350 persons with disability in terms of using the fixed route. They in particular tracked 20 of their trainees, and they found that on average for those 20 trainees, they saved, in terms of reduced costs from paratransit, fewer paratransit trips, on average $2,200 per individual. So overall, you do need time to establish your travel training program and understand the needs of your people and go out and find your market. But once it gets started, we found many systems where the cost-benefit ratio really is very beneficial in terms of travel transit agencies. So the last subtopic within this this strategy is the issue of trip planning services, and in particular, trip planning for people who need accessible trips. With the advent of a lot more information available on the web, with all the information that, say, Google and other software companies are collecting, there's a lot more information. But the key is to gather that information and present it in a useful manner. Transit agencies now often will tell you that whether they know whether their bus stops and or their rail stations are accessible. But the key really is knowing whether the paths of travel to those stops and to those stations are accessible. And so if you look at the next slide. Okay, that sort of one really exemplary program in terms of trip planning and talking about knowing the accessible route is something that one of the places that we took a look at was TriMet in Portland, Oregon. They actually got a grant to and work with the metropolitan area to look at not only the stop itself, but really to drill down to the attributes of the paths to each bus stop, meaning whether they're curb ramps, what the elevations and the slopes are for each of the bus stops, so that people with disabilities really had a good sense of what the paths of travel, what the accessible paths of travel are. This is possible also when your bus system or your rail system is part of the whole municipal government, and so you can coordinate with your public works department to both collect the data, maintain the data, and even prioritize when you are going to be improving, adding curb ramps, including adding sidewalks or other accessible features that are going to be very helpful for people to be able to use your bus system. So let me now move on to the second strategy that that I'm going to talk about, and that is a whole range of fare incentive programs. Basically, this means having lower fares on the fixed route with two purposes in mind. First, to encourage greater fixed route use overall, and also to shift paratransit trips to fixed route. As many of you probably are well aware, of course, all FTA grantees are required to charge half fare on fixed route during non-peak to all seniors and persons with disability, knowing that the definition of persons with disability on fixed route is more broadly defined here as opposed to ADA paratransit. And also, your transit agency can be more generous in this benefit. For example, providing the half fare at all times, not just at peak times. One of the things that we looked at in particular, and actually is one of the things which just on a personal, professional basis, I think is a very good strategy, is actually providing free fixed route service for people who are certified for ADA paratransit. At one point, this is a social policy that you're subsidizing service to seniors and persons with disability who often may have lower income. But this also does save money for your agency. I mean, I took a look at more recent numbers, 2015, that are in the report, where on average overall in the country, it costs the transit agency roughly $4.04 to provide a bus trip, light rail $3.85, heavy rail $2.32. The average demand responsive cost per transit agency was over $35. So even if you take away whatever fare that they might have been paying, which would only be half fare anyway, the cost savings from not providing that paratransit trip is pretty significant. So we looked at the 7 transit agencies that are listed on the slide of Ann Arbor, Arlington, Fort Worth, Hernando County in Florida, MBTA in Boston, Samtrans in California, and the Utah Transit Authority, and we collected data about how well they implemented or what they did to do in terms of implement their free fare for people with paratransit service. Overall, they were all very successful. If you look at the number, the two columns of numbers that we have, what we call the break even, which means how many trips they would have to move from paratransit to fixed route in order to make it worth the lost revenue. And you see that it's used, on the order of 1 to 2,000, where in many cases it was hundreds of thousands of trips that were actually provided free for fixed route. A couple of things I'm sure some people are wondering about is, is this going to lead to abuse, or is this, do I have to go sort of all the way and do free trips, just unlimited free trips? And what we've seen in different agencies to try to limit it, or to control the free trips, some agencies have a limit on how many trips you can have for free, whether it's on a daily basis, a weekly basis, a monthly basis, and that's being recorded by often a smart transit pass. You have a time lag between when you become certified ADA, and this is the second point, and when you start getting the free trips. For example, the MBTA in Boston had paratransit riders when they were first doing the program. They had to wait a year before the free trips kicked in on the fixed route. Other systems say we'll give you the free trips, but you have to undergo travel training before you get the free trips. And whereas other systems, it's not completely free, but it's very low, meaning it's less than the half fare that they otherwise would be paying on the fixed route. And another concern is that, is your ADA eligibility team going to be overwhelmed by the influx of people applying for paratransit just so they can get the free service? Well, what we found in our research is that there is a limited impact if the agency is using in-person interviews and assessments and not merely paper applications. So let me bring you back to Russell. That concludes my discussion this afternoon. So let me bring you back to Russell to talk about some of the other strategies that our team looked at.
Thanks, David. Another strategy that's reported on is alternative service designs. And if you remember back to Marilyn's part of the presentation on the most important factors in whether people use fixed route or paratransit service, number 2 on that list was distance to and from bus stops. And all the other strategies we've talked about up to this point, making the bus stops more accessible, marketing to people with disabilities, travel training, those are great, but they don't do anything about reducing the distance to and from stops. And that was the number 1 factor for 47% of the respondents that answered the survey that Marilyn did. So in this part of the report, we talk about 4 different alternative service designs that you might want to consider. Route deviation, where you're basically running a fixed route, but you will go off route on demand to make pickups and drop-offs. Point deviation, which is you serve certain points at advertised times within your service area, but then you operate on a flexible route basis so you can go right to people's doors at the pickup point or at the destination. Request stop services are, again, basically fixed route services that identify places that you will go off route if you get a call. And so that's a little more limited than route deviation, where you'll go off route anywhere that people request. These are just advertised request stop locations. And then finally, community bus services. And all of these different designs are meant to reduce the walking distance to and from bus stops, bringing the service closer to people. And also they have the benefit of serving all riders in a more integrated way, rather than having people use separate fixed route and paratransit service. The research found that route deviation, point deviation, and request stop to some degree, maybe are more applicable in rural and suburban areas. But community bus services was something that was pretty prevalent, and it was applicable both in urban and rural settings. And one of the major case studies in the report is on Broward County Transit in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And the map on this slide shows the community bus system in Broward County. They've created 18 different community bus services, and they're all designed to serve local communities, but also feed into the regional fixed route service. The regional service runs pretty much north, south, east, west. It's a grid system. And each one of these 18 community bus services does have one or more connection points to the regional service. So you can use them not only to travel in your community, but also get throughout the region as well. And what Broward County Transit does is they provide the capital, they provide vehicles to the communities that want to run a community bus service, and also some limited operating subsidies. And they found this to be a quite successful program for many years. Our research found that they, on average, the 18 systems were operating at 14.8 passengers per hour, and in 2012 they did more than 2.3 million trips just on their community bus service. And then the final strategy that's looked at in the report is using your ADA paratransit eligibility process to support the idea of multimodal travel and utilization of all travel options. And a common theme in the strategy guide is to design your ADA paratransit eligibility process to stress abilities rather than limitations of applicants. One of the things that we saw as we got responses and input from transit agencies across the country is a movement to calling the whole process not applying for ADA eligibility, but a general transportation assessment that looks at people's travel abilities and then identifies for them the different options that they have, their different travel options. Something else we saw pretty widely was providing information on all types of transportation services when you send out applications for paratransit, so people get that in the mail along with their eligibility application. And some systems that had in-person interviews and assessments supplemented those locations with what they called a resource center or something similar that would have brochures and information available that people could pick up on other travel options that both the transit agency offered as well as other organizations within the community. Some of the really small but important things that we noted that people suggested in your application for paratransit, again, to stress abilities rather than limitations, to ask, do you use the bus? And if not, why not? Rather than a question that you often see, which is, why can't you use the bus? As your reason for applying. Similarly, when you're sending out determination letters, stress abilities. So use the phrasing, if you're determining people conditionally eligible, you are able to use the bus except when, and list the conditions, rather than you are eligible for ADA paratransit when. So just a matter of emphasis in the communication. And then another idea would be, as part of an interview or in-person functional assessment, try to identify when people currently are using the fixed route service. For about 30 to 40% of applicants, they might tell you in the application form or in the interview that there are times that they use the fixed route. And when they tell you that, get the specifics and come to agreement with them that there are times that these are times that they could use the fixed route bus and make that part of the eligibility determination. A more complicated strategy for eligibility, but one that has high payoff in the end, is to do a more thorough job of identifying conditional eligibility and then implementing trip-by-trip eligibility. The report contains 2 detailed case studies of the 2 transit agencies that perhaps have the most highly developed trip-by-trip eligibility process in the country, and that's King County Metro in Seattle and Access in Pittsburgh. And we did some cost-benefit analysis as part of the research. In Seattle, they introduced trip eligibility in 2006, and between 2008 and 2011, they found that over 83,000 trips could be made by ADA paratransit eligible riders on the fixed route system. And cumulatively, so for example, if someone was found eligible for fixed route service in 2008, then obviously through 2009, 10, and 11, they would continue to use the fixed route service rather than the fixed route. So each year, the savings multiply. And they estimated cumulatively that from 2006 through 2011, this was just in 2011, they saved about $5.6 million in paratransit costs. And the trip review cost to actually determine trip-by-trip eligibility was about $320,000 that year. In Pittsburgh, the Access system started doing trip eligibility in 2003, and they have much smaller numbers. So in 2011, there were about 46,700 people who called asking for paratransit who were determined able to use the fixed route system and asked to use the fixed route system. But part of that small number was the community already understood that there were times that they should use the fixed route, and when they could, that would be the mode that they would use. So conditional eligibility riders in the Access system make 38% fewer trips than unconditional riders. And in 2011, they estimated a savings of almost $875,000. But the bigger issue in Access is that there are a lot of trips that aren't even called into the paratransit system because conditionally eligible riders have that understanding that they can use the fixed route, and then they do without even calling and asking for paratransit service. Trip-by-trip eligibility, we recognize, really is kind of on the cutting edge, and there are still a lot of systems trying to figure out how to do that and whether they can do that. So one of the perhaps more useful things in the strategy guide are some detailed procedures from Seattle and from Pittsburgh on how they do trip-by-trip eligibility that you might be able to follow to implement it in your area. Some of the important things that we found in implementing this is reviewing the trips to find if they can be made on the fixed route is something that's done outside of the trip reservation process, so you're not extending the call time while you're trying to figure out whether or not the trip can be made on fixed route. But instead, you're having people take each individual's eligibility information for trips that they've requested, and you go out on the street and you actually analyze whether there's an accessible path, how far it is, and whether or not the person would be able to make that trip on fixed route. So the picture over on the right-hand side at the top is from Seattle, and it's one of their mobility specialists who is out evaluating a trip for a current paratransit rider to see if they can do that on fixed route. An innovative thing that they did in Seattle was when they redid their call center, they have a central call center, then they asked the call center contractor to provide 3 mobility specialists as part of the cost of the call center, rather than Seattle Metro itself trying to get those positions approved for their own public agency. In Access, there's a broker, and the broker has staff that equal about a half FTE per year that go out on the street and do evaluations. Once the trip is reviewed, if it's determined that the rider can make the trip by fixed route, then the person is contacted. They don't find out that they aren't eligible for paratransit the next time they try and call for that trip. They're contacted and informed of that in advance. And in both of these systems, they also offered both travel training or, for the first time that the person attempted to use the fixed route service, to have a customer service staff go with them and accompany them on the trip. Another thing that is being done in Pittsburgh and Seattle is to then tag the trips that are have been evaluated in the trip reservation software as either paratransit eligible or fixed route eligible. And that information would pop up for reservationists. So the only thing that the reservationists would have to consider at the time of the call, and something that couldn't be obviously reviewed in advance, would be weather and dusk to dawn issues, if those are things that affect that particular rider's ability to use fixed route service. And then finally, a very interesting and innovative practice from Pittsburgh, the access system, was something called the convenience fare. When they went to their community and they first talked about implementing trip-by-trip eligibility, they got strong feedback from the community that even if people could use fixed route, they still wanted to have the choice of using fixed route or paratransit services. They were not enamored with the idea of the transit agency making that choice for them. So the access system agreed to still provide those trips, but because they were not ADA eligible trips, if it was determined that the person could use the fixed route service, there would be a higher fare charge for that trip. And currently in Pittsburgh, they charge twice the paratransit fare for a convenience trip. And over time, it actually hasn't been something that riders have used significantly, but it is a nice choice that they have. So those are the two initial steps that are outlined in the strategy, and then a whole series of different possible things that can be done, possible strategies that can be used depending upon the particular needs in your area. And the last slide just shows the research team, the companies and individuals involved, and like any TCRP project, there was a project panel that guided the research and provided a lot of input and assistance, and the individuals who were on the project panel are shown on this last slide as well. So that concludes our formal presentation, and I'd welcome any questions. And Lori, if you want to maybe jump in and help out with either questions in the chat room or taking those from people who are online.
Absolutely. The operator, Derek, can you make an announcement?
Certainly. And at this time, ladies and gentlemen, if you would like to ask a question over the phone, please press *1 on your telephone's keypad. Again, that's *1 for the audio question queue.
While we're waiting for that, there was a whole bunch of questions in the chat box. I don't know if people are loath to speak over the phone. I'm trying to keep track of everything now. I guess these are from early on, so they might require some backtracking. But the first question was from, I don't know if I'm saying this right, Shimon Israel. It says, what is the data source for determining fixed route ridership for people with disabilities again? Fair data or survey data? Thanks. If a survey, how administered?
Okay, I believe this is one of the very first things we did in the research to just try and find out which modes people were using, and if this question is related to that part of the research. We got information from 7 different systems, and what we found was the data people had readily available was primarily their fare data. So how many trips were made using the reduced fare. We did go in, and then if that reduced fare was available to both seniors and people with disabilities, we tried to get an idea of what % of people signed up for reduced fare were seniors versus people with disabilities, and then we prorated the ridership that way to just count trips by people with disabilities. But if you were doing this in your own area and you wanted as a baseline to find out how do people travel in your area, perhaps you would do this through periodic surveys as well. It was just the data we had available to us to try and find out what the current use is.
Derek, is anybody waiting in queue?
We do have one question in queue from the line of Dan Pierce. Please proceed.
Hi, I was curious. You showed a slide with TriMet and showing the surrounding infrastructure and accessibility for bus stops. I was wondering what a good guide for how big a buffer would be good. I think in the book it lists about a quarter mile is what most people use, but I was wondering if that is the standard or if going further, possibly up to a half mile or 3/4 of a mile or even 1 mile would be doable and beneficial at all.
I think that's a question for me. This is Buffy. The quarter mile was used to assess ADA paratransit ridership, figuring that if you were conditionally eligible, that's the distance you would travel. So I'm not sure if that's answering your question. In terms of assessing the pedestrian infrastructure, you're really looking at sort of the immediate environment, you know, how it connects to sidewalks and such. So I'm not sure that there's any sort of distance that's a threshold. Does that answer your question at all?
Yeah, for the most part. I'm doing a research project for Des Moines Area Regional Transit here in Iowa, and I'm looking at accessibility from sidewalks and streets for disabled people, and I'm just trying to figure out how big of like a buffer I should do for doing an inventory of surrounding infrastructure like sidewalks and ramps and stuff to the streets. So
yeah, I mean, when we're doing the inventory, I mean, we've been hired at a number of different transit agencies to do the actual inventory, and we do sort of the immediate area, like you saw on some of those slides. You know, we're not going for like a half a mile beyond. We're just looking at the immediate pedestrian infrastructure.
All right, so kind of like towards the end of the block.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in many cases, the sidewalk doesn't even connect to the bus stop, so that's sort of useless for someone in a wheelchair. You know, you need to make it meaningful. And once they're on a sidewalk, one would hope that the sidewalk would go somewhere. We're actually doing some work in a different city where the sidewalks are very broken. So if you were going to do the type of eligibility assessment that Russell was just talking about, you would have to look beyond, you'd have to look at actually someone's path of travel, because there may be a sidewalk connecting to the bus stop, but it may stop a half a block away. And so that would be a problem depending on where the person is coming from. But if you're doing a whole bus stop inventory, I mean, you know, it depends how much money you have to do this.
And this is David Shah. My company is also working on doing a big bus stop inventory, and our policy has been to look to being able to cross the street both in the direction of travel as well as to the other side of the street. You know,
right. You basically go to the next intersection.
Yeah.
You know, in an urban area.
Right. Both parallel and perpendicular to the path of travel.
Okay, yeah, that answers my question. And if possible, could the presentators list their emails in the closed captioning at the end if you guys are willing to accept emails on additional questions?
I think, were they at did we have those at the beginning?
The second slide in, maybe?
On the second slide, I think. Okay, I just put the slide up now. If anyone wants to contact any of the authors, you can copy their information down right now. I put that slide up for everybody. Derek, is anybody else on hold on the line?
No further audio questions in queue.
Okay, so I guess we'll tackle the chat questions are kind of piling up, and they do go back earlier. So I don't know if it's a bad idea to go back and start at the beginning, or should I guess we'll go chronologically. The second question was from Tracy Harrington, who asked, how are half-fare riders identified as disabled versus elderly?
Read that to me again, Lori. How are what fare riders?
Half-fare
riders?
Yeah, half-fare riders identified as disabled versus elderly.
And I believe, and again, this I'm assuming this question relates to our study of the 7 selected systems comparing fixed route and paratransit ridership. And David, correct me if I'm wrong, but if the half-fare program was for both, we drew a sample of people who were signed up for that program and then looked at whether or not they had signed up as a senior or as a person with a disability, and then we prorated the ridership that way. Is that correct?
Correct. I think that's at minimum. I think now with people with electronic fare cards, that might be directly recorded, and collected by transit agencies. If the fare card doesn't simply say half fare, but as you say, under what category you're getting a half fare.
Right.
The next, there's two questions. Well, they're similar. One is from Sherman Purnell. It says, in the case of shrubbery, it is privately owned. Who is responsible for making it accessible? And that was followed up by a question from Sarah Dunlap that said, what about snow maintenance on sidewalks? Who is responsible? Those two kind of go together.
Well, the shrubbery really belongs to the private homeowner, assuming that it's on private property. So you would sort of lean on that homeowner to do the trimming. Perhaps they'd be happy to have somebody else do it for them. And then in terms of snow removal, again, it depends on if it's public or private property. I know I'm in the D.C. area, and actually the D.C. government has a requirement that you have so many hours, I think it's 24 or 48 hours, to basically shovel your sidewalk, and if you don't, you can get fined. I'm not sure who's out really monitoring that and counting the hours, but it depends on if it's private or public property. But I know in some major snowstorms we've had, you see people in wheelchairs actually out on the street because the streets are plowed before the sidewalks, and of course that's not particularly safe.
No.
And I can, just a specific example here I work in the Boston metropolitan area, where the MBTA, even though they are not legally responsible, they see it as to their own benefit. So they have gone on their own initiative and actually shoveled out, just like their key rail stations, they have shoveled out key bus stops. And they have, told the various municipalities that they will do the shoveling of the bus stops, but not of the full accessible route.
Okay, the next question, again from the chat box. This is, I guess, a follow-up from Sarah Dunlap. It says, regarding targeted outreach, you should run your outreach materials, flyers, etc. by the local agency. Oh, I guess that's a statement, not a question. Sorry.
Which is true.
Sure.
That's a good statement, though.
Yes.
Sorry. So I guess I should finish it. So by the local agencies to make sure everything is clear and accurate.
Yes.
Then Sherman Purnell said, in the findings section on slide 18, what is the basis for the savings and what is it based on? I guess we have to go back to slide 18.
Yeah, which one is 18?
That's a good
It might be one of mine.
I think
that's fare strategies, free fare, David.
Okay. Can we jump to it to make sure that I'm responding to?
Yeah, I'm trying to see. I'm not sure what it looks like.
Can we just jump to it?
18. We can, but
I'm jumping.
Okay. Oh, you're taking it.
I was jumping too. We were both jumping it. Okay.
There we are.
What is the basis of the savings is the estimated number of fewer paratransit trips provided. Minus any fare. So it's the reduced cost for paratransit services.
I think there are two more questions that were from this slide. Also, Will Kenlaw asks, "What's in the $2,200 savings?"
And again, it's the same. It is this is the average per rider for paratransit trips not taken, and the baseline is what they had done in the past before travel training.
I don't know, was that answering my question about the $2,200 savings, or?
Yes.
No? Okay, and then someone asked, Sherman Purnell asked again, are there grants that offset the lost revenue?
Well, the lost revenue is fixed, is fixed route fares, and I think at the federal level, the answer is, to answer your question directly, the answer is no, there aren't, but the amount of fare revenue lost is well exceeded by the savings of not having to provide the paratransit service. So that is why, that is the incentive for fixed route agents, fixed route operations to do that.
Okay, the next question was from Katie Best. It says, how does the ADA rule out the fare for paratransit having to be equal to fixed route apply? I didn't read that really well. If an agency offers free fare on fixed route.
The paratransit fare has to be zero.
Be free, yeah.
Yeah.
2 times 0 is 0. And this has actually come up in a number of compliance reviews where people offer downtown shuttles or other specific routes within their system that are free fare. And at least in those areas, trips that have both origins and destinations in those areas on the paratransit system then have to be provided free fare as well. It's not for any paratransit trip that originates or ends in that area, but it has to both begin and end in that free fare zone.
William Mosel asked, in the Uber age, what strategies, aside from free fare, can be implemented to coerce very long-term ADA paratransit riders who are passionate about affordable door-to-door service to choose fixed routing as an option?
In the Uber age, I'm not sure the Uber age would change anything that we've said about all these different strategies. They would all still apply in my mind.
Well, I think maybe sort of thinking ahead is that if people are trying to provide first mile, last mile services, I mean, some transit agencies are coordinating with the TNCs, the Ubers and Lyfts, to do that kind of thing sort of on an informal basis, like in Atlanta and Dallas. There's the agency in Florida that actually has a more formal arrangement.
Yeah. Pinellas County, who's one of our listeners, participants.
Right. Yeah, maybe that person wants to talk about that, but there was something in the recent Transit Access Report, the Office of Civil Rights was, raising some possible issues with that in terms of the accessibility of the TNCs.
The next question is from Johnny Dunning. He references slide 19, so I guess we need to jump ahead one slide.
Mm-hmm.
It says, quote, significant impacts where only paper applications were used, end quote. Does this mean that using only paper, online applications has a bigger impact in shifting riders to fixed route?
No, it's actually the other way around. Is that when we say significant impacts, meaning significant impacts in terms of a greater sort of surge in applicants for ADA paratransit services, because it's much simpler to if the motivation, which we rarely know, of someone applying for ADA paratransit is simply to get free trips on the fixed route, filling out a paper application is a much simpler thing to do than having to schedule an appointment and then going in and having an interview and an assessment. So that's what we're saying. When there's only paper, there are more people who will apply.
The next question was from Tracy Harrington, but I'm not sure if it was for the presenters or for the chatting that was sort of going on between participants, but I'll read it anyway. It says, does anyone have any suggestions on the most effective way to install wayfinding devices at bus stops that would assist people with visual impairments aside from Braille?
Well, I know that in experimental or pilot programs, there is a school in the Boston area called the Perkins School for the Blind, which has developed an app which they are trying to actually identify and by description bus stops within this service area. And it's very labor intensive to set up because you've actually got to do it for every bus stop. But once it's done, then I know that people have been very happy with it on a limited basis for the stops that they have provided these descriptions.
The next question was from Yolanda Velasquez. It says recipients operating fixed route systems may use up to 10% of their annual formula appointment at the capital project with a ratio of 80/20 federal/local share. What is the advantage of using the fixed route if the ratio is still the same 80-20 or 50-50. It's hard for me to read these questions because I don't actually know all this stuff. No one has an answer?
I'm not sure I follow the question.
No.
Okay. All right. Well, Yolanda, if you're still there, maybe you could send an email and clarify that. Again, we have another Uber question. Okay, that wasn't a question.
Pardon the interruption.
Okay,
Yolanda just queued up.
Okay.
Her line is now open.
Yeah, this is Yolanda.
Hi, Yolanda.
Yeah, as far as I know, that if you're operating an ADA paratransit, you can charge the cost as a 80-20 instead of 50-50. So if we encourage to use ADA to fixed routes, so we're going to lose that advantage of 80-20.
Oh, because even though the ratio might, and I'm assuming that what you're saying, Yolanda, is correct. The cost is so much less that even though you're getting a smaller share, the cost to the grantee is still going to end up being a lot less. Paying 50% of a lot less is better than paying only 20% of a much bigger amount.
Yeah, and the average paratransit trip cost is it's in the $25 to $30 range, and on fixed route you're talking maybe $2 to $4 in that range.
Right,
so
right.
Even if you apply,
so we encourage use fixed route, still the cost still cheaper rather than using the paratransit. Is that correct?
Oh,
yeah,
Definitely.
Even if they're different funding ratios, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
The next question was from Judy Shanley. How do you think the increases in mobility management networks have influenced the use of fixed route?
I think mobility management networks can help identify for people all of their travel options. So we talked about that a little bit in eligibility, instead of just focusing on paratransit as a primary mode, making people aware of all of the travel options that they have, fixed route, other organizations and services in the community, as well as the paratransit service. And I think transportation management agencies have really helped in doing that, developing that information and making it available to people. That would be my take. Anybody else?
No? Okay. The next question was from Pat. How can disabled passengers be told to participate in travel training in order to have free fixed route if you cannot require travel training?
Because getting free fixed route is not an obligation of a transit agency. So you can use that as an incentive for them to take travel training. They would still be likely eligible for the half fare on the fixed route. But free fixed route is something which a transit agency has the option to offer or not offer.
This is Marilyn. David, you mean offer, right? You're still not requiring the person. You can always offer travel training, but you're never requiring it.
You could require it in order them to receive the free fixed route.
The free fixed route fare to receive something that's not an ADA paratransit requirement.
Correct.
To receive something that goes beyond the ADA paratransit requirements.
Yes.
Next, Brent LaBrosse asked if there were any Canadian cities involved in transit training programs presently. I don't know if you covered that or not, that area.
We didn't look at Canadian agencies, but I would be shocked if they weren't doing a lot of travel training in Canada as well. They have their own Canadians with Disabilities Act and many of the same issues on the transit services that we do, and a similar approach to serving people with disabilities. So they're pretty progressive on that front.
The next question is from Tony Lynch. Can persons with cognitive disabilities be required to participate in travel training on fixed route for those trips that they take frequently and are therefore familiar with the locations?
I think we already kind of answered that travel training can't be required.
Okay. And I think
it can be encouraged, but not required.
Encouraged, not required. I think the last question, because I'm trying to weed through and not read the statement and, again, the conversations that were happening between participants, is from Lulu Feliciano. It says, can someone address the study done in New York adjusting the use of Uber-type services since paratransit is so expensive? Again, back to the Uber question, I guess.
I'm not familiar with that study. Anybody else on the team?
I think there's been some stuff in the transit literature. Remember some of the online resources talking about they've used car services for a while as a backup, but I think they're now looking at TNC type services as well. But I'm not sure how far that's gone.
Yeah, I know New York and many transit agencies have a combination of dedicated capacity, so vehicles that are put out for so many hours a day, and then you schedule trips, paratransit trips to those, as well as something called non-dedicated capacity. So that could be taxis, it could be Uber, it could be limousines, or other nonprofit services that have sedans and vans. And then you can give them paratransit trips, one trip at a time. You're not scheduling to their vehicles, but you're referring those trips and having them serve them. So I think your guess is probably right, Buffy, that they're looking at Uber and other services like that to maybe expand their non-dedicated capacity.
Yeah, because they're already using taxis and livery cars for that purpose, and there's a lot of information about same-day taxi subsidy programs, and I think that along those same lines, agencies are looking at potentially using the TNCs as well. But in my mind, there's a real question about accessibility.
I was just going to say not only accessibility, but even if you serve as a non-dedicated provider to a transit agency for their paratransit operation, there's still some minimum requirements that you're going to have to meet in terms of training and insurance and the like, maintenance and the like, and that would be kind of a challenge with the TNCs.
Right.
That was the last question in the chat box. Derek, is there anybody else on the line? No?
We did get a couple in queue. First one is Ross Slides.
Hello, Ross Silvers here from Pinellas Suncoast Transit Authority. I wanted to comment on the TNC issue. We do have a sandbox grant to look at using a combination of TNC, taxi, and other options for ADA paratransit customers. And it should be interesting because we also have a last mile solution for all of our service area to be able to get people from their home to certain designated bus stops and therefore avoid the whole barrier of not being able to get to the bus stop. And so the thought is if we can get people who are ADA customers into the sandbox comfortable with it, then they'll help spread the word about how effective the services can be and accessible, and people will be willing to try outside of the sandbox using the non-ADA paratransit service of first mile, last mile for everyone and get around that barrier.
And Ross, this is for the general public, not just persons with disabilities, correct?
Yes, the first mile, last mile is for the general public to use the various services, taxi, TNC, wheelchair van, et cetera.
This is Marilyn Golden. How are you providing equivalence on your first mile, last mile for wheelchair users?
Yeah, it's not a problem. We have 2 wheelchair providers who we've worked with for years, and they use wheelchair vans to provide the service. And so they'll be also available upon demand to provide trips, and there's no difference in cost or service experience for the customer.
Good.
Yeah, the Sandbox program from FTA has made real efforts to ensure the equivalence issues at least the wheelchair access equivalence issues, I would presume the others as well that Russ, that you were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's very important to us. I used to be a disability rights coordinator, so it's not something that I'm going to take for granted.
Good.
Good, thank you.
You're welcome.
Derek, next to you.
We did have one from the line of Johnny Dunning. Your line is now open.
Oh, no, that was just, I had made an incorrect slide reference to my question, but my question has already been answered. Thank you.
Okay. No further
Perfect
questions?
timing.
So there's no further questions? Okay, does anybody have any parting words? No?
Thank you all for participating, and we were very happy to be able to share these strategies and different approaches with you.
Great. So I would like to thank everyone for participating in this webinar, the presenters and the participants. A very special thank you to Russell, Marilyn, Buffy, and David for your informative presentation. As a reminder, I would like everyone to know that you will be receiving an invitation to fill out a survey for this event. NPI greatly appreciates your feedback, and I promise it won't take very long. So thank you all for joining us. Bye.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes today's conference. We thank you for your participation. You may now disconnect. Have a great day.